Some cars were never meant for the spotlight, too fast, too wild, or too ahead of their time. These machines were forbidden from the start. Built in secret, killed by law, or buried by the automakers themselves, they vanished before most people ever laid eyes on them. Here are 12 forbidden American cars you've never seen, and the shocking reasons why you were never supposed to. The 1971 Plymouth Satellite GTX 426 Street Hemi is one of those phantom machines that seems to flicker in and out of muscle car folklore, the kind of car whispered about in garages and drag strips, where someone always knows someone whose uncle almost bought one. And that's because it very nearly existed, but not quite. It was a forbidden fusion of old-school dominance and new-era dread. A car that could have been the final word in factory muscle, had Plymouth not slammed the door shut just before it breathed life. By 1971, the writing was on the wall. The golden age of muscle was unraveling, fast. Insurance premiums were skyrocketing for high-performance models. Emission standards were tightening with no end in sight, and high-octane fuel was being phased out. The Street Hemi, Chrysler's 426 cubic inch legend, was already a dinosaur in a world turning toward restraint. In 1970, you could still get one in a GTX or Roadrunner if you knew the right box to check. But 1971 was different. The redesigned 71 Satellite and its performance twin, the GTX, were sleeker, lower, and meaner looking than ever before. They rode on a new fuselage body with a fastback profile, an aggressive grille that made the car look like it was always mid-snarl. Underneath, the chassis was stiffer, the brakes were improved, and the styling was meant to signal performance. But under the hood, that's where things turned tragic. Officially, the 426 Street Hemi was still available in the GTX for 1971, but only on paper and only in incredibly small numbers. The vast majority of 1971 GTX buyers opted for the 446-barrel or 440 Super Commando. The Hemi was prohibitively expensive, carried warnings from insurance companies, and was, in many cases, quietly discouraged by dealers. Plymouth was under intense pressure from corporate to wind down the Hemi program. It had served its purpose, won its trophies, and now was considered a legal and financial liability. Orders placed for satellite-based GTXs with the Hemi were often stalled, rerouted, or outright denied by corporate. Behind closed doors, the word came down, no more, especially not in the basic satellite trim, which was never officially approved to receive the Hemi from the factory. But that didn't stop a few from trying. At least 2 documented satellite-based GTXs with 426 Hemis were reportedly built, not through normal production, but through dealer connections and internal favors. These were cars ordered with specific codes, shipped as 440 cars, and then fitted, either at the dealer level or in backroom factory prep shops, with a crate Hemi or pulled from inventory engine before delivery. One such car, rumored to have gone to a Southeast drag racer, was delivered in vitamin C orange with a 4-speed Dana 60 rear end, no air conditioning, and minimal options. The only thing it was equipped to do was annihilate the quarter mile. Others may have existed as test beds for NHRA programs or super stock conversions, but they were never listed in sales literature and never acknowledged in any public Plymouth communication. Internally, Chrysler engineers were bitter. The Hemi was still a monster, 425 HP on paper, more like 470 in reality. With slicks, a 4-speed, and the right gearing, it could still run 11s all day, even in a heavier 1971 body. But the world had moved on. The suits wanted cleaner, quieter, safer. A 426 Hemi in a full-size fuselage-bodied satellite, that was seen as reckless, a threat to the brand's image, and worse, to their legal exposure. One Plymouth zone manager was quoted in a memo from late 1970. "We will not authorize Hemi installation in non-approved packages, regardless of individual dealer demand. The risk is disproportionate to the benefit." And just like that, the final opportunity to build a true street Hemi satellite was buried under red tape, legal anxiety, and changing times. Today, those few ghost cars, whether dealer swapped or factory enhanced through back channels, are virtually priceless. They represent the absolute final gasp of the Hemi era, a time when raw horsepower still roamed free, but only just. No fanfare, no special badges, just unfiltered violence wrapped in a fading body style. And for those who've seen one in the flesh, it's unforgettable. Because it wasn't just rare, it wasn't just forbidden, it was the last breath the Hemi never got to take. And Plymouth, sadly, never let it inhale. The 1987 Ford LTD Crown Victoria Interceptor 460 V8 test mule was never meant to be remembered, and Ford made sure of it. It was a relic built during a strange moment in automotive history when engineers still dreamed of raw, unfiltered power, even as the world was turning toward efficiency, regulations, and front-wheel drive. It was, quite literally, a dinosaur in a patrolman's uniform, and the last thunderous rumble of an era that was about to go extinct. By the mid-1980s, the full-size Ford LTD Crown Victoria was the backbone of police fleets across America. Built on the aging Panther platform, it was boxy, rear-wheel drive, and tough. Officers loved it for its simplicity, long wheelbase stability, and allowing visibility and predictable handling. But in an era of increasing highway chases and interstate patrols, Ford began to wonder, could they give the Crown Vic one last performance upgrade before emissions and fuel economy killed off traditional pursuit vehicles? That's where the 460 V8 came in. A massive, big block engine more at home in 70s Lincolns and F-250s than in modern patrol sedans. With displacement measuring 460 cubic inches, 7.5 liters, the engine was already an antique by 1987, but it had torque in spades. Nearly 500 pound-feet in its PMM. By the mid-80s, emissions strangled most of its horsepower, bossed down to around 240-250 HP, but it still offered a kind of brute force highway muscle that no small block could match. Perfect, some engineers thought, for high-speed highway interceptors in rural states like Texas or Arizona. Ford quietly built a small number of Crown Victoria Police Interceptor test mules with the 460 V8 under the hood. Most were based on stripped-down LX or fleet models, repainted in black and white livery with HD suspension, heavy-duty alternators, reinforced radiators, and rear-end gearing optimized for pursuit work. These cars weren't built for acceleration. They were built for sustained velocity. And in that regard, they delivered. One test report clocked a prototype at over 135 mph, unheard of for a patrol car in the mid-80s. But that was where the good news ended. The massive engine overwhelmed the aging chassis. The extra weight up front ruined handling balance, and braking performance became inconsistent under stress. Fuel economy was abysmal, often dipping below 7 mpg in real-world testing, even worse under pursuit simulations. And worst of all, the 460 could no longer pass updated California or federal emission standards, even with every smog component Ford could bolt on. It failed NOx tests repeatedly, and retrofit catalytic converters either melted under heat or strangled the output to the point that the car could barely beat the 351-powered model. Internal Ford documentation from the time noted that while the car meets or exceeds acceleration benchmarks, it poses an unacceptable compromise in emissions performance, fuel cost, and long-term reliability. There were also serious concerns about cooling. After multiple extended test runs, 2 vehicles suffered from vapor lock and overheating issues during staged pursuits in the Arizona desert. The 460 was never designed to operate in small engine bays under such thermal stress, especially with police-grade electrical loads running full-time. Emissions regulators were less diplomatic. When Ford submitted the prototype for preliminary EPA assessment, it was reportedly laughed out of the facility. One emissions lab manager allegedly quipped, "You're trying to smog a battleship." And that's essentially what it was, a battleship wearing a badge, loud, thirsty, unstoppable, and completely out of step with the modern world. Faced with overwhelming compliance issues, Ford quickly shut the project down before it could reach certification. All known test units were ordered crushed by the end of 1987. None were sold to departments. None reached the press. and no official mention of the project was ever released to the public. Only whispers remain, from engineers who watched it thunder down the test track, from officers who rode along during top-speed runs, and from a few fleet managers who had a chance to see the prototype's sheer menace before it vanished. One retired Ford fleet development staffer would later summarize it simply: "It was a dinosaur that almost joined the force. Big, loud, dangerous, and totally unstoppable, until reality caught up." And with that, the big block pursuit car era came to a final, unofficial end. No more 440s, no more 460s, just memories of a time when cubic inches ruled the road, even if only for a moment. The 1969 Rambler Rogue 390 Go Package prototype was a classic case of internal sabotage, not from malice, but from fear. In a company as small and scrappy as American Motors, every product decision mattered. Every badge, every platform, every trim level had to be justified and aligned with a razor-thin budget. So when engineers built a prototype compact car that was faster, cheaper, and arguably better than AMC's own flagship muscle machines, the suits stepped in and killed it. Quietly, permanently. The Rambler Rogue was AMC's compact coupe based on the American platform and positioned as a sensible, no-frills alternative to bloated Detroit iron. But in the late 1960s, sensible was starting to look like a liability. Youth buyers were flooding showrooms, demanding power, color, and flash. AMC had already launched the Javelin as a pony car and the short wheelbase AMX as a two-seat brute. Both used the new 390 cubic inch Typhoon V8. AMC's answer to the big blocks of Ford and GM. The engine was stout, high-revving, and surprisingly advanced. But what if you put it in something even smaller? That was the question asked by a group of rogue engineers, no pun intended, inside AMC's experimental vehicle group. Working under the radar, they took several base model 1969 Rambler Rogue coupes and dropped in the 390 V8, paired with a 4-speed Borg-Warner transmission and a set of prototype free-flow exhaust manifolds. Suspension was borrowed from the AMX, as were quick-ratio steering gears and stiffer leaf springs. A Dana rear axle completed the package. On the outside, the test cars were nearly invisible, save for low-key Go Package graphics, red-line tires, and a discreet hood scoop stolen from a Javelin SST. But when testers hit the throttle, the illusion broke. The 390 in the Rogue's smaller, lighter body turned the car into a rocket. It could rip from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds and easily outrun a stock GTO or Mustang 390. It was nimble, tossable, and lighter on its feet than any other AMC product. And it didn't rattle like the AMX or understeer like the Javelin. It was, in a word, brilliant. And that was the problem. AMC's marketing and product planning teams were horrified. The Rogue was meant to be an economy car, a humble, retiring nameplate that was being phased out. If word got out that it could outperform the AMX, which cost significantly more and was the centerpiece of AMC's performance image, it would undermine years of branding. There were also fears it would cannibalize sales of the new Hornet and jeopardize AMC's already tenuous relationship with emissions regulators and insurance providers. Several internal memos from early 1969 showed just how quickly the project was strangled. One AMC executive wrote, "The Rogue 390 is a political landmine. If it leaks, we lose credibility across the board, with dealers, with the press, and with our own performance division." Despite glowing test results, the Rogue 390 was canceled before it was ever shown to the public. The prototype cars were either scrapped or quietly repurposed for component testing. No brochures, no press kits, no production numbers. AMC simply erased it, or tried to. Yet at least 2 of the prototypes are rumored to have survived. One, painted Matador red, was spotted decades later in Wisconsin, fitted with drag slicks and 390 Rogue decals that looked suspiciously factory-made. The other supposedly lived a second life as a dealership demonstrator in Kenosha, until it mysteriously disappeared after a press leak scared corporate into a vehicle recall. Owners who remember them say the same thing. It felt like an AMX in a business suit. You'd pull up next to a Roadrunner, and they'd laugh. Then you'd disappear before the light turned red. In the end, the 1969 Rambler Rogue 390 Go Pack was AMC's secret weapon that never fired. It was built to punch above its weight, to take on the muscle elite using brains instead of budget. But it threatened too much. It worked too well. And AMC, in one of the most ironic moves in muscle car history, killed it not because it failed, but because it succeeded. And so it remained a whisper, a street brawler AMC never let into the ring. The 1996 Chevrolet Caprice SS LT4 prototype is one of the great what-ifs of the American performance sedan world. A full-size four-door with Corvette blood pumping through its veins, built in secrecy during the twilight of GM's rear-wheel drive land barges. It was big, bold, and brutally fast. And just as quickly as it came to life, it was extinguished. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. To understand how close this beast came to reality, you have to rewind to the early 90s, when Chevrolet was enjoying a quiet renaissance. The Corvette had finally become a world-class sports car again. The Camaro was reborn with an aggressive LT1 V8, and in a surprise move, Chevy turned the dowdy Caprice into the sinister 1994-96 Impala SS, a car that proved Americans still wanted big, fast sedans. But in 1996, something even wilder was brewing in GM's engineering garages. The Caprice platform, shared with the Impala SS and known as the B-Body, was set to be retired after that year. But before the factory lights went out, a group of Chevrolet engineers decided to push the platform to its absolute limit. They had access to the LT4, the 330 horsepower version of the Corvette's LT1 V8, used in the 1996 Corvette Grand Sport and 6-speed manual models. Compared to the standard 260 HP LT1 in the Impala SS, the LT4 had higher flow aluminum heads, a more aggressive camshaft, 10.81 compression, a revised intake manifold, and redline raised to 6,300 RPM. It was not just more powerful, it was louder, angrier, and alive in a way the LT1 never quite was. Engineers fitted the LT4 into a special Caprice chassis with subtle upgrades, beefed up cooling, improved fuel delivery, and a reprogrammed 4L60E automatic transmission that could take the higher redline and quicker throttle response. The suspension was retuned with stiffer springs and D-carbon shocks, and the brakes received higher performance pads and dual-piston front calipers. Even the exhaust was tweaked, with a deeper growl that betrayed its Corvette origins. From the outside, it looked almost like a sleeper. Devoid of the Impala SS's monochrome menace, the prototype Caprice SS wore chrome trim, civilian hubcaps, in the standard body cladding. But under the hood, it was a completely different animal. In testing, the Caprice SS LT4 sprinted from 0 to 60 in just under 6 seconds. Quicker than the Impala SS, quicker than most sports coupes of the era, and shockingly fast for a car that still had room for 6 adults and a trunk big enough to hold a pair of spare tires. It pulled hard all the way to its electronically limited top speed and delivered power in a silky, relentless wave. On long highway pulls, it was untouchable. Even senior GM executives who took it out for evaluation drives reportedly came back grinning and shocked. But that's when the problems began. The LT4 Caprice didn't fit the fleet car image that GM had so carefully cultivated. The Caprice was still primarily sold to law enforcement, government agencies, and taxi companies. A 330 HP Vette-powered version would confuse buyers, and worse, scare off departments worried about safety, and cause, or overzealous officers. Internally, there were also concerns that the Caprice SS LT4 would upstage the Impala SS, or worse, cannibalize Corvette prestige by offering the same power in a $25,000 sedan. Insurance companies, too, were a looming threat. The Impala SS already carried a performance rating that pushed some younger buyers out of the market. A 330 HP version could have made the car virtually uninsurable for civilians, let alone departments with liability budgets. And so, just weeks after it had shown such promise, the project was quietly shelved. No press release, no prototypes sent to auto shows, no official photos, just a memo from GM brass. The Caprice program will end with the current powertrain lineup. No further development is authorized. At least one Caprice SS LT4 prototype is known to survive, locked away in GM's Heritage Center, or in the hands of a retired engineer. A few others may have been crushed or stripped of their engines and repurposed for testing. One former Chevy engineer later said, "It was the Impala SS's meaner cousin. Smarter, faster, cleaner. We should have built it, but GM got cold feet." And that's the legacy of the 1996 Caprice SS LT4, a full-sized American bruiser that could have redefined the performance sedan, just as the world turned away from big V8s. It was the right car, with the wrong name, in the wrong year, and so it vanished into the archives, a final missed opportunity before the Panther cars, the rear-drive Chevys, and the muscle sedans of the old guard disappeared for good. The 1970 Mercury Cougar Eliminator Boss 429 is one of those rare, tantalizing ghosts of the muscle car era, a machine so perfect in form and function that its very existence seemed to threaten the carefully curated hierarchy of performance within Ford Motor Company. It was fast, rare, and possibly superior to the Boss 429 Mustang itself. And for exactly those reasons, it had to die. By 1990, the Cougar was no longer just Mercury's fancy Mustang. It had become a refined yet aggressive pony car in its own right. Longer, wider, more luxurious, but still a legitimate performer when optioned correctly. The Eliminator package, introduced in 1969, gave the Cougar a serious attitude adjustment. Spoilers, stripes, competition, suspension, and a full suite of engine options that included the Ford 28 Cobra Jet and Super Cobra Jet. But deep in the skunkworks, Mercury engineers had an idea even bolder than anything officially offered. What if they put the Boss 429 into the Eliminator? The Boss 429 engine, originally developed for NASCAR homologation, was Ford's ultimate expression of big block engineering, with Hemi-style aluminum heads, forged internals, and a unique dry deck block designed to breathe at high RPMs. Though detuned for the street to a claimed 375 HP, real-world numbers suggested well over 500 when properly uncorked. It was a monster. The problem? Ford only allowed it in the Mustang, and even then only in limited numbers, and only through a special conversion program handled by CarCraft in Brighton, Michigan. But CarCraft didn't just work on Mustangs. They were also involved in experimental builds across the Ford and Mercury lineup. And at some point in late 1969, they were handed a Cougar Eliminator body and a Boss 429 crate. The resulting car was a stunner, a bright competition blue Eliminator with a blacked-out hood scoop, Boss 429 decals on the fenders, and a powertrain that made it a full-fledged race car for the street. Internally, it was designated a one-off prototype for drag racing and high-performance evaluation. Externally, it looked like something from a fantasy catalog. The Cougar's slightly longer wheelbase and heavier nose gave the Boss 429 more room to breathe, and ironically, better weight distribution than in the Mustang. Drivers who tested it reportedly found it smoother, more stable, and more comfortable at triple-digit speeds. The rear suspension, shared with Ford's larger intermediates, soaked up power launches without axle hop. The power came on like a tidal wave, and the deep rumble of the Boss engine through dual exhausts was described as thunder in a tailored suit. There were hopes, even internally, that Mercury might offer a limited run of Boss 429 Cougars as drag strip specials, a Mopar-style move to throw down against Dodge and Plymouth in the NHRA Superstock classes. But Ford said no. Hard no. Why? Because Ford was fiercely protective of the Boss branding. The Boss 302 was for road racing, the Boss 429 was for NASCAR, and the Mustang was its chosen chariot. Allowing Mercury to use the engine in a luxury-leaning Cougar would dilute the Boss identity, according to internal documents. There was also the issue of marketing. The Cougar was sold as a gentleman's muscle car. How do you sell a gentleman a raw, high-strung NASCAR power plant that idles like a tractor and needs race gas to run right? And there were politics. Mercury had always played second fiddle to Ford in the performance world. Every time Mercury created something brilliant, like the 1964 Comet AFX cars or the Cougar GTE, Ford quietly stepped in to rein it back. The Mustang needed to be the star. The Cougar was not allowed to outshine it. So the Boss 429 Cougar was canceled before it ever officially existed. Only a few test cars were built, most likely one or two by Carcraft and possibly a third assembled later using leftover parts. They were never advertised, never offered for sale, and never raced under the Mercury banner. Ford buried the idea, and just like that, the most powerful Cougar ever imagined vanished into the archives. One Mercury engineer later remarked, "It was too perfect, too fast, too clean. If they had sold it, the Mustang guys would have rioted. So instead, they made us pretend it never happened." Today, the existence of any original Boss 429 Cougar is hotly debated among collectors. A few clones have been built using Carcraft parts and eliminator shells, but original documentation is virtually non-existent. Photos of the prototype are rare, and Ford has never officially acknowledged the project. But for those who believe, and those who heard that thunder on the proving grounds, the memory lingers. Because the 1970 Mercury Cougar Eliminator Boss 429 wasn't just a forbidden car, it was a masterpiece. And it was killed not by cost, not by law, not by failure, but by the quiet, brutal logic of corporate politics. The 1980 Pontiac Grand Am Turbo 301 was a car born out of desperation and experimentation. A turbocharged gamble in an era when American performance was fading into a fog of regulations, rising fuel prices, and corporate identity crises. It was sleek, surprisingly quick, and ahead of its time in execution. But its greatest enemy wasn't horsepower or reliability, it was red tape. And in the end, that was enough to bury it permanently. By 1980, the American performance landscape was a wasteland. Gone were the high-compression big blocks and screaming small displacement screamers of the 60s. What remained were strangled V8s making pitiful power, wrapped in bloated badge-engineered shells. Pontiac, once the fire-breathing face of GM muscle, was suddenly rebranding itself as a driving excitement division. But it had almost nothing to deliver on that promise. That's where the Turbo 301 came in. Originally developed for the ill-fated 1980-81 Pontiac Trans Am turbo models, the 301 cubic-inch V8, 4.9 liters, was a short-stroke, lightweight engine built specifically to handle boost. It featured a lower compression ratio, beefier internals, a revised block casting, and a unique electronically controlled Garrett turbocharger system. It wasn't fast by muscle car standards, rated at just 210 HP, but it delivered smooth, linear torque and a futuristic driving feel in an age of sluggish V8s. Seeing the success of the Buick Regal Turbo and eager to give the Grand Am some legitimate performance cred, Pontiac engineers began testing a special version of the 301 Turbo in the redesigned 1980 Grand Am, a mid-size coupe with European-inspired styling, better aerodynamics, and a more rigid unibody than its full-size relatives. The car was meant to compete with the likes of the BMW 5 Series and Audi 5000, with Pontiac's own uniquely American twist. The result was startling. With the 301 Turbo under the hood, the Grand Am became one of the fastest mid-size sedans GM had. Quick off the line, effortlessly strong in the mid-range, and blessed with better chassis balance than its Trans Am sibling, thanks to less weight and a longer wheelbase. Paired with a THM 350 automatic, it glided through traffic with a quiet menace. Test drivers reportedly loved it, but the honeymoon was short. When the prototype Grand Am Turbo was sent for pre-certification emissions testing in California and at GM's own Milford Proving Grounds, things went sideways. The carbureted turbo setup, despite its sophistication for the time, simply couldn't meet the new NOx and CO2 regulations required for mass-market certification. The engine was prone to detonation under certain loads. The turbo response caused surging in closed-loop mode, and the catalytic converters couldn't scrub the exhaust clean enough, fast enough. It failed hot start tests, cold weather tests, and altitude compensation tests. Pontiac engineers scrambled to revise the turbo maps and carb calibration. They even tested a crude early form of computer-controlled mixture enrichment, but it wasn't enough. To make the car compliant, Pontiac would have needed to develop an entirely new EFI-based turbo system from scratch. something Buick was already doing with its future Turbo 3.8 V6. But Pontiac didn't have the budget, or the support, or the time. GM pulled the plug on the Grand Am Turbo 301 before it could be shown to the press. The few test cars were either crushed or repurposed for other evaluations. No brochures, no badges, not even a whisper in dealer training materials. The car simply vanished. One Pontiac development engineer, years later, said it best. It was the only turbo project we had that didn't feel like a gimmick. It was smooth, faced, and refined, but every time we tried to make it legal, the system would just choke on itself. It had boost, and bureaucracy killed it. Today, the idea of a boosted Grand Am sounds almost laughable, especially given how far the model fell in later decades. But in 1980, for one brief moment, Pontiac had a sleeper on their hands. A car that could have rewritten the script for performance sedans at GM. Not loud, not flashy, just fast where it counted. But emissions were merciless. The car was too clever for its carburetor and too ambitious for the air it breathed. And so, like so many turbo dreams of the era, it was quietly erased. Another victim of the decade where power was outlawed by chemistry. The 1962 Chevrolet Nova SS 409 is one of those legendary prototypes that exists on the fringe of muscle car mythology. An unholy union of lightweight compact body and heavyweight big block power. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't sanctioned. And when it did happen, it scared the very people who built it. The Nova, or Chevy 2 as it was originally called, was Chevrolet's answer to the Ford Falcon and the growing compact car market. It was designed to be light, economical, and affordable, a no-nonsense alternative to the finned behemoths of the late 1950s. The 1962 model was simple: unibody construction, conservative styling, and a lineup of modest engines, the most potent being a 327 V8, producing about 300 horsepower in the top-level SS trim. But that wasn't enough for some GM engineers. At the time, Chevrolet's performance department was on fire. The 409 cubic-inch big block V8, born from the W-Series truck engines, was dominating superstock drag racing and street racing alike. In a full-size Impala, it was already a rocket. But what if you put that same 409 into something 1,000 pounds lighter? Someone at GM decided to find out. Behind closed doors, a small team of engineers quietly modified a 1962 Nova SS Coupe and shoehorned the massive 409 V8 under the hood. This wasn't a bolt-in affair. The firewall was hammered back. Custom motor mounts were fabricated. The steering gear had to be relocated slightly, and cooling was a nightmare, even with an oversized radiator. The front end squatted under the weight, but the car was drivable. Barely. The power-to-weight ratio was astonishing. In early tests, the car could tear through the quarter mile in the low 13s, quicker than almost anything else GM had in its catalog, including the Corvette. The combination of the Nova's sub-2,800-pound curb weight and the 409's 400-plus horsepower turned the car into a rocket ship. But it was a deeply unstable one. The unibody chassis flexed under hard launches. The suspension, never designed for this kind of torque, twisted and bottomed out. The narrow track and short wheelbase made high-speed runs terrifying. Test drivers reported wild oversteer, poor traction even with drag tires, and alarming brake fade after just a few hard stops. On wet pavement, it was undrivable, and it got worse. One of the early test mules reportedly suffered a suspension failure during a hard pull, causing a loss of control and minor crash damage. No injuries, but it was enough to set off alarms. GM brass, already concerned about the image of putting a drag race engine into a compact family car, pulled the plug immediately. All future development of the 409-powered Nova was halted. No public mention was made. The prototype cars, at least two of them, were dismantled and scrapped. Some internal documents still survive, one of which reportedly noted, "Project exceeded power thresholds for platform. Safety and stability concerns prevent further testing. Vehicle is to be retired." That was corporate speak for, "This thing is insane, kill it." Unofficially, it's believed that at least one of the test engines made its way into a drag car on the East Coast, possibly run by a GM-connected racer who had access to prototype parts. There are persistent rumors of a black-on-red Nova SS that ran at New England drag strips in the mid-1960s with a mysteriously strong big block. But the factory never acknowledged it, and they never offered it. And yet, in a way, the idea lived on. The seeds of the 409 Nova would eventually blossom into the brutal 1966-68 L79 and later Copo Novas, with 396 and even 427 big blocks, this time with more structural support, improved suspensions, and a bit more common sense. But none of them had the raw madness of the first experiment. The 1962 Nova SS 409 was lightning in a very small, very thin-walled bottle. It wasn't just fast, it was dangerous. It wasn't just a prototype, it was a warning. And that's why it never saw the showroom. It was too small to survive the 409's fury, and GM made sure it never would. The 1989 Chrysler LeBaron GTC VNT prototype coupe stands as a compelling testament to Chrysler's bold ambition during a period when the American auto industry was grappling with a changing landscape. Emissions regulations tightening, fuel economy mandates rising, and a growing demand for technology that could deliver performance without compromise. It was an era when turbocharging was viewed as the magic bullet for squeezing power from smaller engines. Yet most systems were still rudimentary, plagued by lag and mechanical fragility. Chrysler's VNT, variable nozzle turbocharger system, was an answer not just to lag, but to redefine how turbo engines responded and performed, promising a level of responsiveness and efficiency previously unseen in mass-market cars. The LeBaron GTC itself was Chrysler's mid-size personal luxury coupe, a sleek, stylish car with upscale trim and sporty intentions, designed to capture buyers who wanted more than just transportation, but less than a full-blown muscle car or European sport coupe. In 1989, its turbocharged 2.2L four-cylinder was already a respectable performer, but engineers dreamed of unleashing something extraordinary. This dream came in the form of the Turbo 4 engine equipped with a cutting-edge variable nozzle turbocharger. Unlike traditional fixed-geometry turbos, which suffer from sluggish spool times at low RPM and a narrow sweet spot, the VNT technology used adjustable vanes inside the turbocharger turbine housing to optimize exhaust flow dynamically. At low engine speeds, the vanes close down, increasing exhaust velocity and making the turbo spool up quickly, delivering near-instant boost. At high RPMs, the vanes open to allow maximum flow without restriction, maintaining power and preventing overboost. The result was a turbo system that delivered smooth, linear, and immediate power across the rev range, something almost magical compared to the jerky, lag-prone turbos typical of the day. Chrysler's engineers installed this prototype turbo system into a LeBaron GTC coupe, retaining the elegant coupe's full luxury appointments while dramatically boosting its performance. Test drivers described the car as an absolute revelation. The boost comes on like a switch, not a slow wind-up. It pulls hard from just above idle, yet it never feels jerky or disconnected. The throttle response is unlike anything else on the market. The car accelerated faster and more cleanly than turbo LeBarons had before, and the engine sounded alive and aggressive, a far cry from the flat, muted performance of the base 2.2L turbo. Despite the electrifying performance, however, the VNT system was a technological infant. The variable vanes, operated by an intricate actuator system, were delicate and vulnerable to the harsh realities of real-world use. Early prototypes experienced vane sticking due to carbon buildup, corrosion, and heat cycling. These failures led to turbo lag returning unexpectedly, or worse, total loss of boost. Repairing or replacing a VNT turbocharger was expensive, requiring specialist labor and costly parts, which made the prospect of high warranty content claims a serious concern for Chrysler's corporate risk managers. On top of the mechanical issues, the engine management system needed to perfectly coordinate boost control, fuel delivery, ignition timing, and emissions output. But Chrysler's engine control units, ECUs, at the time were limited, and integrating the VNT controls caused intermittent faults and complicated diagnostics. Fuel quality was another problem. Lower octane or inconsistent fuels increased the likelihood of knock, further stressing the system. Emission compliance was also a thorny challenge. While the VNT system improved throttle response and power delivery, it was difficult to keep NOx and particulate emissions within the ever-tightening EPA standards using the carbureted or early fuel-injected systems available. Recalibrating the system for emissions control without losing drivability was a tough balancing act, and testing cycles revealed frequent failures under cold start and high-altitude conditions. All these technical hurdles compounded one another, and the cost to fully refine the system was projected to be astronomical. With Chrysler already in a precarious financial state and turbocharged cars carrying a mixed reputation for reliability, executives decided to pull the plug before the technology could damage the brand or balloon warranty costs. The LeBaron GTC VNT was quietly canceled just months before production was to begin. Most prototypes were dismantled or cannibalized for parts. The program was swept under the rug. The VNT turbo concept was shelved for over a decade before re-emerging in diesel engines and eventually high-performance gasoline engines with more robust controls and materials. Looking back, the 1989 LeBaron GTC VNT Coupe was a car caught between two worlds. Ahead of its time in technology, the 1975 Buick Century GSX Stage 2 is one of those rare automotive legends whispered about in hushed tones among muscle car enthusiasts, a ghostly remnant of Buick's brief flirtation with unrestrained power in an era when the muscle car was gasping for breath under the crushing weight of the oil crisis and tightening government regulations. This was muscle car madness pushed to the absolute edge, raw, relentless, and utterly out of place in the mid-1970s. Buick's Century GSX debuted as a bold statement in 1973, combining the full-size Century's roomy comfort with a sportier suspension and a hefty 455 cubic inch V8. It was Buick's answer to the muscle car drought, offering a blend of luxury and brute force. But by 1979, muscle cars across America were being strangled by emissions rules, skyrocketing insurance costs, and shrinking fuel supplies. Yet somewhere deep inside Buick's performance division, the urge to build something truly wild never died. That's where the Stage 2 program comes in. Internal documents and rare eyewitness accounts suggest that Buick quietly built one or two Century GSX Stage 2 prototypes, cars that were basically race-ready from the factory. Under the hood sat hand-assembled, heavily modified 455 big block engines, tuned to rumble with ferocity far beyond the standard 350 360 HP. These 455s were fitted with high-flow cylinder heads, forged pistons, aggressive camshafts, and upgraded carburetors. The power plants reportedly made over 450 horsepower, an astonishing figure for a car released well into the Malaise era. To keep the weight in check and improve performance, Buick engineers experimented with lightweight fiberglass body panels, hood, fenders, and even doors in some cases, a rarity for a full-size car at the time. Inside, the GSX Stage 2 featured upgraded suspension components borrowed from race programs, heavy-duty sway bars, competition springs, and revised shock valving. The brake system was beefed up with front disc brakes and enhanced cooling ducts. The resulting machine was a powerhouse with the soul of a race car, but the frame of a sedan. It sprinted from 0 to 60 in just over 6 seconds. Lightning fast for a big 4,300-pound luxury coupe in 1975. Quarter-mile times dipped into the mid-13s, with a thunderous exhaust note that shook neighborhoods and rattled the rare fiberglass panels. But for all its ferocity, the Stage 2 GSX was doomed. The oil embargo of 1973 had sent gas prices soaring, and American consumers were fleeing thirsty V8s for compacts and imports. Insurance companies, wary of high-powered muscle cars, slapped astronomical premiums on anything over 300 horsepower. Emissions regulations demanded catalytic converters and strict fuel management systems, sapping performance and complicating tuning. Buick's marketing department knew this car was a non-starter, a relic of a muscle car era that was already dying. Faced with the cold reality of a hostile market, soaring costs, and regulatory hurdles, Buick quietly scrapped the Stage 2 program before the car ever reached dealerships. Only a handful of test cars were ever built, and those were either crushed, stripped for parts, or locked away in GM's engineering vaults. No official documentation was released, and the car faded into obscurity. Collectors and historians have pieced together fragments of the Stage 2 story from whispers, surviving parts, and scant photos, but it remains one of the most mysterious muscle cars of the malaise era. One former Buick engineer reflected, "It was pure insanity, the muscle car we wanted to keep alive, screaming loud and proud. Even when the world told us to shut up, we built it for ourselves, not for the showroom." The 1975 Buick Century GSX Stage 2 was muscle in its rawest, most defiant form. A fleeting howl before the silence, a last rebel roar before the curtain fell. It was muscle in the malaise era, and it never stood a chance. The 1994 GMC Sonoma GT V8 was never supposed to exist, and that's exactly what made it so special. Conceived in the shadows of GM's corporate labyrinth, this compact pickup was a direct spiritual successor to the legendary GMC Cyclone, and in some ways it was even more radical. Where the Cyclone relied on a turbocharged V6 and all-wheel drive wizardry, the Sonoma GT V8 was built around a simpler, more brutal concept. Shove a full-size Chevrolet small block V8 into a lightweight compact pickup, tune it to run like a Corvette, and let it loose. And for a brief moment, it worked. Brilliantly. Too brilliantly, in fact. In its standard form, the Sonoma GT was a cosmetic and minor performance upgrade over the base truck. Lowered suspension, a sportier grille, monochrome paint, and a 4.3L V6. It was respectable, but far from revolutionary. What the engineers at GMC wanted, however, was something wilder. Something that could pick up where the Cyclone left off without the complexity of turbocharging or AWD. And so, in secret, a handful of development mules were fitted with the venerable 5.7-liter 350 CI small block V8 pulled straight from GM's muscle car parts bin. Early tests showed stunning results. With over 250 horsepower and mountains of low-end torque, the Sonoma GT V8 could do 0-60 in the mid-5-second range, territory usually reserved for serious sports cars. Weighing hundreds of pounds less than a full-size Silverado or even the Cyclone, the truck was a sleeper missile, and its compact size made it nimble in ways no muscle car ever could be. Imagine a stripped-down rear-wheel drive go-kart with the heart of a Corvette. That's what the Sonoma GT V8 felt like. It was raw, loud, brutal, and terrifyingly fast. But speed was only half the story, because behind the scenes, the Sonoma GT V8 stirred up a storm of corporate infighting, risk aversion, and political sabotage that would ultimately doom it. The biggest threat didn't come from the outside. It came from within GM itself. The full-size truck division, the company's financial crown jewel, saw the compact V8 truck as a dangerous anomaly. It was fast, flashy, and affordable. Too affordable. Why would performance-minded buyers spend more on a big Silverado SS or upgrade to a performance package when this nimble monster was half the price and twice the fun? The answer terrified executives who were already nervous about the looming insurance backlash against high-horsepower vehicles. Drivetrain reliability was another hurdle. The Sonoma was never designed for that level of torque. Even with upgraded internals, beefier axles, reinforced transmissions, and tuned suspension, the platform struggled under the strain. Test units suffered from wheel hop, frame twist, and premature wear during aggressive driving. Fixing those issues would have meant further investment and delay. But GM had already made up its mind. Then came the liability concerns. In an era when lawsuits were mounting and safety watchdogs were circling, the idea of a compact pickup with this much power, without stability control, without traction aids, without airbags, made corporate attorneys break out in a cold sweat. Even a small production run was deemed too risky. Just one crash, one lawsuit, and the whole experiment could backfire. And so, it was quietly erased. Not with fanfare or press releases, but with memos and meetings. The prototypes were either dismantled or locked away. The internal documents were buried, the engineers were reassigned. It didn't matter that it worked. It didn't matter that it was thrilling. What mattered was that it didn't fit the plan. Years later, one GMC insider would describe it this way. It scared the wrong people. It was light, fast, cheap, and didn't ask permission. That kind of car doesn't survive at a company like GM. It was a detour, and we weren't supposed to take it. Today, the Sonoma GT V8 exists only in memory and whispered rumors. No production models were ever sold. No brochures were printed, no photos released. It was a Corvette in truck's clothing. Too strong, too fast, and too dangerous for the corporate world that created it. It was the fast lane detour GM didn't want to take. And once you've seen it in your rearview mirror, it's already gone. The 1970 Ford Torino King Cobra represents one of the most intriguing and tragic what-if stories in the annals of American muscle car and NASCAR history. A car born in the feverish heat of the Aero Wars, but extinguished by a sudden shift in regulations and corporate strategy before it could reach its true potential. This car wasn't just a follow-up, it was Ford's last desperate bid to reclaim supremacy on NASCAR's high-speed ovals after the legendary Charger Daytona and Plymouth Superbird had entered and then abruptly exited the scene. The saga began in the late 1960s when Dodge and Plymouth stunned the racing world with their radical wing machines, the Charger Daytona and Superbird. Ford, which had dominated NASCAR with the Torino, Talladega, and earlier muscle cars, was suddenly on the back foot. In response, Ford engineers crafted the original King Cobra in 1969, which featured aerodynamic enhancements such as a sleeker nose, a massive rear spoiler, and a high-performance 429 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8. Though only a handful were built, the King Cobra was intended as a homologation special to keep Ford competitive at the highest level of stock car racing. However, by 1970 and 1971, NASCAR began clamping down on aero devices and restricting engine displacement. The sanctioning body banned massive rear wings and other aerodynamic appendages, aiming to slow speeds and improve safety after years of dangerously high lap times and numerous crashes. This regulatory crackdown abruptly ended the Aero Wars, leaving manufacturers scrambling to adapt. In this volatile context, Ford began work on what's now known as the King Cobra Phase 2. This new iteration was designed to outmaneuver the competition with a long, streamlined front end engineered in wind tunnels to slice through the air more efficiently than ever before. The nose was longer and more pointed than the original, with flush-mounted headlights and subtle front spoilers designed to reduce drag and increase stability at high speeds. It was a stealthier, more aggressive design meant to win both on the track and in the showroom. Beneath the hood, Ford intended to equip the King Cobra Phase 2 with the potent 429 Super Cobra jet engine, a factory-built beast capable of delivering massive torque and horsepower, suitable for NASCAR and street performance alike. This engine was heavily reinforced and tuned with the latest performance parts, making it a perfect match for the aerodynamic improvements in theory. But the new NASCAR regulations that came into effect in 1971 outlawed these radical aerodynamic devices and severely limited engine displacement for aero cars. The sanctioning body also imposed restrictions on the number of cars that could be homologated with wings and other aero modifications, effectively neutering the Phase 2 before it ever got off the ground. The rules rendered the entire King Cobra Phase 2 program illegal for competition. Ford executives, facing the end of the Aero era and the costly investment needed to homologate a car that NASCAR wouldn't allow, pulled the plug. Only 3 prototypes were ever built, and the project was quietly killed. Most of the cars were reportedly destroyed or stored away in deep corporate archives, never to be seen again. The loss of the King Cobra Phase 2 was a huge blow to Ford's racing ambitions. It symbolized the abrupt end of an era where horsepower and aerodynamics battled fiercely for supremacy on the track, where engineers pushed the limits of design in search of speed. What could have been a game-changing model, potentially dominating NASCAR circuits and thrilling muscle car fans, was instead relegated to the shadows. Those few prototypes that remain today are among the rarest and most coveted collector cars, shrouded in mystery and legend. They stand as a testament to a moment frozen in time, when innovation met regulation and the sport's brutal realities cut short a promising future. An engineer involved in the project once reflected, "We had poured everything into the King Cobra Phase 2. It was going to be the fastest, most advanced aero car Ford ever built. Then NASCAR changed the rules overnight. Suddenly, all that work was worthless. We built a dagger, but the fight was over before we could draw it." The 1970 Ford Torino King Cobra Phase 2 remains an eternal symbol of muscle car ambition cut down by forces beyond the workshop. A sleek, powerful weapon never allowed to be unleashed. It was the dagger Ford never got to unsheath, a brilliant but tragic footnote in muscle car and racing lore. The 1994 GMC Sonoma GT V8 stands as one of the most fascinating what-if stories in the history of American performance pickups. A rare glimpse into a bold experiment that combined raw muscle car power with the practicality and nimbleness of a compact pickup, only to be buried deep by corporate politics, liability fears, and internal rivalry. Emerging in the wake of the GMC Cyclone's thunderous success, the Sonoma GT V8 was poised to rewrite the rules of performance trucks. Instead, it was quietly shelved, fading into obscurity as one of GM's most tantalizing lost projects. In the early 1990s, the performance pickup segment was nascent but rapidly evolving. The Cyclone, with its turbocharged 4.3-liter V6 and all-wheel drive, stunned the market with supercar-level acceleration, achieving 0 to 60 mph times well below 6 seconds, an unheard-of feat for a pickup. It was a revelation showing that trucks could be more than just workhorses. Riding on this momentum, GMC engineers envisioned something even more explosive, installing a V8 engine into the lightweight Sonoma GT, the sportier trim of GMC's compact pickup. Under the hood, the Sonoma GT V8 packed the legendary 5.7 oil, 350 cubic inch Chevrolet small block V8, the same powerhouse that propelled Camaros and Corvettes of the era. Tuned for a balance of street ability and performance, this engine churned out over 250 horsepower and a muscular torque curve that turned the Sonoma from a humble truck into a lightning-fast pocket rocket. With a curb weight barely tipping the scales over 3,000 pounds, this combination yielded blistering acceleration, mid-5-second 0-60 times, rivaling many contemporary sports cars. Beyond raw speed, the Sonoma GT V8's handling surprised even veteran test drivers. Its nimble unibody chassis, upgraded with sport springs, performance-tuned shocks, and beefier brakes, offered surprisingly sharp cornering and composed road manners for a pickup. The V8's smooth yet aggressive power delivery combined with this balanced chassis to deliver a unique driving experience. Part muscle car, part pickup truck, unlike anything on the market. But behind the scenes, the project encountered significant hurdles. GM's full-size truck division, a cash cow bringing in massive profits, viewed the compact V8 Sonoma as a threat to its dominance. Executives were wary of investing in a niche, high-performance compact that could cannibalize sales or tarnish the image of their larger, more traditional trucks. There's anecdotal evidence of internal friction and even deliberate slowdowns in development and funding, as different factions within GM jockeyed for control and influence. From an engineering perspective, the Sonoma's drivetrain and suspension needed substantial reinforcement to safely handle the V8's torque. Axles, half shafts, transmissions, and rear differentials were not originally designed for this power level, and retrofitting them increased costs and complexity. This technical challenge, combined with the need to ensure reliability and durability for everyday driving, further complicated the project. Liability and insurance concerns loomed large. The combination of high horsepower and a small pickup raised red flags in risk assessments, with worries about loss of control accidents and expensive warranty claims. Insurance companies were reluctant to support performance trucks, threatening to impose prohibitive premiums that would cripple sales. For a company balancing tight budgets and wary of controversy, these risks were unacceptable. Ultimately, GM's corporate leadership made the decision to quietly kill the Sonoma GT V8 program. Prototypes were dismantled, a development document shelved, and the idea buried to protect GM's broader truck strategy. It never saw the light of day in showrooms, never bore a badge, and never received the acclaim it might have earned. One engineer involved in the project recalled years later, "We had a truck that could run with Corvettes and dance through corners like a sports sedan. The Sonoma GT V8 was a blast to drive and proved that pickups could be exciting and fast. But the corporate landscape just wasn't ready for it. The suits upstairs didn't want to risk the full-size truck business, and liability concerns sealed the deal. It was a fast-lane detour GM never wanted to take." Today, the 1994 GMC Sonoma GT V8 remains a legend among enthusiasts, a potent blend of Corvette power and pickup agility that never made it beyond the secret test tracks and engineering labs. It's a symbol of what could have been, a compact muscle truck that combined utility, nimbleness, and raw performance in a way few others have. It was an audacious experiment, a shining example of American engineering daring to challenge conventions. And it died because it was too fast, too strong, and too disruptive for corporate comfort. It was a fast lane detour GM didn't want to take.